All right, welcome in. It is the Breer Report for October the 16th, mailbag edition. As always, we have more answers to more of your questions on the mmqb.com in the print edition of our mailbag. Be sure to check that out. But as always, we're going to answer three of your questions right here, right now. The first question coming from Bernie Barmazel. That's at Bernie Barmazel. I hope I pronounced your name right, at least on one of those two tries. Bernie asks, good afternoon, Albert. Do the Cowboys sign George Pickens to a 3 to 4 year extension before the end of the season? Bernie, it's interesting you asked that because somebody else in the mailbag this week asked whether or not the Cowboys would trade George Pickens ahead of the November 4th deadline. I think some of that, of course, could hinge on how the next few weeks go. Do they get deeper into the NFC East race? Do they fall out of the NFC East race? Obviously, there are a lot of moving parts in that roster after the Micah Parsons trade. So going forward, where are the Cowboys? Well, right now, they're gathering a lot of good information on George Pickens. He's on pace for 90 catches, almost 1,500 yards, 17 touchdowns. He's having the best kind of year at the exact right time. A huge piece of this, of course, is because they need him to play a bigger role because CeeDee Lamb is out with the high ankle sprain, and he's taken full advantage of the opportunity that's been put in front of him because of the injury to Lamb. Now, I think there are a couple of questions you have to ask if you're the Cowboys on how to proceed here. Number one, you have to be very honest with yourself about whether or not you intend to sign him to an extension. And if you were to tag him after this year, I think the price on that tag would be about $26 million. If you were to extend him, we're talking about a contract that would likely be into the 30s somewhere on a per year basis. So to me, the real decision they've got to make here is whether or not you can carry two receiver contracts of that size on your books when you're already paying your quarterback $60 million a year. Remember, CeeDee Lamb is making $34 million a year. So if you were to sign George Pickens to a deal at, say, $31 million, let's just give you that number just to give you something to work with. Now you're paying $65 million per year. And I know that's not the real number because you're folding in years, but $65 million per year, new money on the receiver position, on two receivers, on top of $60 million to the quarterback. So almost half of your salary cap is not just tied up in three players. It's tied up in three players in one phase of the game. So how are you able to build up the other parts of your team if you've got so much tied up in one phase of the game? I think it's an interesting question to ask. They can delay the decision, of course, by giving George Pickens the franchise tag, $26 million for 2027 or 2026, and then make that decision down the line. They could try to tag and trade him. So that's one question, is whether or not you're willing to take on that sort of receiver contract when you've already got a receiver contract like it on your books and you've got a quarterback who's at the top of the market, the very top of the quarterback market. So that's question number one. The second question here would be whether or not you're convinced that this is a George Pickens you're going to get going forward. Now, remember, the Steelers had a chance to keep George Pickens. They could have re-signed him this offseason if they wanted to. Instead, they made the decision to trade for DK Metcalf, to pay DK Metcalf, who had not been in their building, who had washed out of another team. Of course, he had asked for the trade from Seattle. And then they turn around and they trade George Pickens. So there's a reason for that. And it's because, while George Pickens wasn't disliked in the Steelers building, there was always something with him. And whether it was how much he was getting the ball, whether it was how locked in he was, there was always something. And, I worked with someone in New England TV years ago, Troy Brown, who played years and years in the NFL, who had a great saying for this sort of thing. Money only makes you more of what you already are. So while George Pickens has been a good teammate, a good player, obviously, in Dallas, is a focal point of that offense, how would he coexist long-term with CeeDee Lamb when he's on the contract? He's got that security. Would he revert to some of the things that wound up putting Pittsburgh in a position where they were a little hesitant to pay him? I think all of those questions are interesting ones to ask, and those questions are the ones the Cowboys have to ask internally, especially if they wind up falling out of the race and somebody comes along and offers them something significant for Pickens while he's still under contract before they have to tag him. So, look, this becomes a good problem to have because the Cowboys traded for George Pickens hoping for the best, and they've gotten the best. And so now some bigger decisions need to be made. Again, this is how you hoped it would play out. And now we see where it goes. But when CeeDee Lamb comes back, there's got there's a real chance that this looks pretty good. And so you'll get a look at it over the back half of the season. Question number 2, this is from Nick and Chuggett. That's at Colts GPT. With the Colts playing well, do you think they're going to be buyers at the trade deadline? I love this question, Nick, and because there are not any real glaring holes on the Colts roster. I don't look at a position and say, man, they're in trouble there. They need to take care of that. And that's kind of where they saw themselves coming in. And I think that's part of why they made the decision to sign Daniel Jones in the offseason, why they felt like he was the right player for them, because they felt like he could operate their offense. And I've used this stat a million times now. I'll use it again. It's one of my favorite stats from the summer. The Colts were 29th in total defense and 30th in giveaways last year and still won 8 games. And so their feeling was, if we can win 8 games, despite really being broken schematically defensively, despite really being sloppy offensively, what can we do if we can clean those 2 things up? They bring in Lou Anarumo to run the defense. That, to a large degree, has been fixed. They bring in Daniel Jones to run the offense, and that, to a large degree, has been fixed. So I think the reason I bring that up again is because so many things on their roster were already right, and that's the bet they were making in bringing in Daniel Jones. So what can you add? I know a lot of people always want to add a receiver. I'd be careful about upsetting the equilibrium that you have at that position now with Michael Pittman, Alec Pierce, A.D. Mitchell, Josh Downs, and then Tyler Warren at tight end. I think they've got a really good mix there. Obviously, they've got the running back. They've got a good young offensive line. Everybody could use an offensive lineman. Those are hard to find. So then you flip it over to the defense. If there's a defensive player available, that's where I think it would be. And to me, it would either be for a pass rusher to add to that mix with Leatu Latu, or a corner to add to the mix with Charvarius Ward. Will those players become available? Well, there's one that does make some sense. Watch Thursday Night Football tonight. If the Bengals lose, and the Bengals lose again, and all of a sudden now that it looks like they're slipping a little bit out of the race, could you make a phone call on Trey Hendrickson? Hendrickson, of course, worked with Lou Anarumo in Cincinnati, so the scheme fit, that's there. He could be one to be interesting to look at. Now, the Colts made a play for Trey Hendrickson in the summer, and they did talk to the Bengals about it. The Bengals asked for a lot. They asked for a high-end draft pick. They asked for Grover Stewart. They wanted a lot to trade Trey Hendrickson there. Would the price be the same if the Bengals were to fall out of the race? We'll see. The Bengals clearly aren't there yet. They just traded for Joe Flacco. Clearly, they're trying to see if they can get themselves back in it. But I think that would be the area you would look if you're the Colts. It'd either be a pass rusher or a corner. Finally, question number 3. This is from D. Lavoie. That's at David __Lavoie. Thoughts on the Panthers? I think it's interesting that they are 0-3 on the road. They're 3-0 at home. How does the rest of the league view Bryce Young after 2 years? Well, I think you have to give the Panthers credit for their resilience. And I think this is a huge piece of what Dan Morgan, Brant Tillis, and of course Dave Canales have been looking to build in Carolina. So much of it for Dave has been about modeling a certain type of player and then trying to fill every position you can with that type of player. Edgy, tough, and I know these things can be cliches, but resilient. And you see it with some of the guys that they drafted, like certainly I think Nick Scorton is somebody who fits that mold and what they've been looking for. Rico Dowdle was somebody they were talking about over the summer, somebody who could fill that sort of role. We see now, what he's capable of doing. Even Teteroa McMillan, who's sort of like a low burn personality, they felt like he had some of that. So I think you're seeing what you're seeing with Carolina from a global standpoint is like some of those guys they already had that were that type of player, like a J.C. Horn or a Derek Brown or an Ike Ekwonu, mixed now with some of these new guys they brought in. And really, I think you've got a tough, resilient group. I don't think they're there yet, but you got a tough, resilient group that clearly can ride some things out. Now, as for Bryce Young, this is an interesting one because they're going to have a big decision to make on him after the year. This is his 3rd year. So that means after this year, he's eligible for a new contract. They're also in a position to give him his fifth year option, make a decision on his 5th year option. That 5th year option is probably going to be around $30 million. It would lock the Panthers in for 2027. So that money's fully guaranteed. So essentially, when you exercise that 5th-year option on a player, particularly a quarterback, you're saying that guy is going to be here for another 2 years. Are the Panthers willing to do that? Are the Panthers willing to entertain an extension? Because this is the point where you've seen some of these guys, you've seen teams turn the page on young quarterbacks. It was the Browns turning the Browns, that's really where the page began to be turned with Baker Mayfield, right? Like that was right, like in that decision where you're making the decision on the 5th-year option, where you look at it with Baker Mayfield and it's like, okay, like, are we going forward with Baker Mayfield as our quarterback? Are we not? They went into 2021 with Baker. Baker gets hurt. And then they wind up trading Baker after his 4th year as he's going into his 5th-year option. They trade him to the Panthers the year before that. The Jets made a similar decision on Sam Darnold. And like in those cases, I don't think it's that those teams didn't like those players. It just had gotten to a decision point. And it, so often with homegrown quarterbacks, it's either we pay them $55, $60 million per year or we move on. And so like that's sort of what's interesting about the situation the Panthers are going to be in with Bryce. Do you use that as your point to move on? Do you try to delay the decision for another year like the Browns did with Baker? And obviously the Browns wound up being wrong about that, but they did delay that decision for an extra year with Baker after making the playoffs with him in 2020. It's just an interesting spot that the Panthers are going to be in. And obviously over the back half of this year, they're going to collect more and more information on which way they go. And will they be in position to draft one next year? That's another part of the equation here. So it's a pretty interesting spot to be in. The Panthers, obviously the arrow is pointing up on them right now. It does look like a lot of the moves that they made in the offseason are starting to pay off. I'm excited to see what they can do with it because, again, they were really in on the personality of the team. They were really in on the culture of the team in the summer and really felt like what Dave Canales was looking to instill in year one, like they were really starting to get it right before year 2. And I think that's shown up early on and how they've responded after they've gotten beaten up, like to get beat up the way that they did in New England and bounce back with with 2 straight wins, I think says a lot about where they're at. To beat the Cowboys the way they did, to come back against the Dolphins after falling behind in that game. You really started to feel some positive momentum here for the Panthers. And again, we'll see what that means for Bryce Young long term. As always, you can give us your feedback. We love your feedback. You comment right here below on the YouTube channel. You can get to me on social media, at Albert Breer on Twitter, at Albert_Breer on Instagram, at Albert R. Breer on Facebook. Appreciate you guys coming out. We got one more Breer report. Week 7 is about to be underway. We will see you guys tomorrow.